Madam President, this bill before us is an act of legislative barbarism. This is an act of extortion being leveraged on the United States Senate right before Christmas. Make no mistake why this happens. This bill, in all 4,155 pages of its glory or infamy, was negotiated in secret by 4 or 5 members of Congress, excluding all others, which means that nearly 330 million Americans were disenfranchised in the production of this legislative behemoth. They wrote it utterly in secret, with the design of creating an artificial emergency, threatening a shutdown right before Christmas. In fact, they set up government funding to expire the day before Christmas Eve, realizing that that's when members are at a point of vulnerability. Members of both houses and both political parties want to get home, understandably, to spend the holidays with their families. It's also the moment when they realize that our constituents are most vulnerable, most fearful of something like a government shutdown. That's when the most pressure will be brought to bear on members of the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, if heaven forbid there were a shutdown. And so at this time of manufactured crisis, they decide that is the right moment to unveil this bill that they've drafted in secret. The part that's stunning is that enough members of the United States Senate, a body that prides itself on being the world's greatest deliberative body, would choose to support this bill, never having read it. That really is stunning. As an entity that strives to be the world's greatest deliberative body, we sure don't act like it sometimes. But we should. Our rules, our traditions, our customs, and our obligation to our constituents demands nothing less. We and those we represent deserve proper, full consideration and the chance to read, debate, and amend this legislation and not get circumvented through some backroom deal. So opposing this legislation isn't radical. Running our government this way is, and it's indefensible. It used to be, Madam President, that amendments and debate and discussion were a common practice of the legislative process. It's what the legislative process is all about, in fact. Now, these days, we have to beg, plead, and barter, feeling lucky for any legislative scraps thrown to us underneath the table. It's not the legislative process. It's certainly not a legitimate way to keep our government funded. There's no greater priority, nothing more impactful than voting on legislation to fund the government, especially when you lump all of the 12 categories of appropriations bills into one giant bill, an omnibus spending package, as we call it. When you have something like that, in theory, you could have a fair process surrounding that, but you would need a considerable amount of time for public notice and debate and discussion, and yes, an opportunity for amendments. A bill like this could be rendered fair if it were cured through weeks of open amendment process, where this was subjected to discussion and review under the light of day. And yet, Madam President, here we find ourselves, having received this legislative text. It's not just us who have been excluded. It's not just we who have been excluded. It's the American people. It's the media who have been excluded from this process until less than 24 hours ago. And all of a sudden, they drop 4,155 pages of legislative text, and they expect us to be ready to go within a few hours to vote on it. And to vote on it under particularly extortive conditions. They'll tell you, okay, we've got this bill now. This bill is ready for you. It's up to you. You've earned your election certificates. You are free to vote yes, or you're free to vote no. But by the way, if you vote no, you'll be causing a government shutdown, and we'll make sure that you are blamed for a government shutdown. And by the way, we will also threaten to take away not only your Christmas, but the Christmases of millions of Americans in the process. That's not fair. That's not free. That's not operating our government as a constitutional republic that it was intended to be. It's not even a representative government at that point. That becomes a legislative oligarchy in which a small handful of people, we might call it the law firm of Schumer, McConnell, Pelosi, McCarthy, puts together a bill entirely in secret and then uses extortion to extract votes out of it. Tragically, a number of members seem to express gratitude for their ability to vote on the finished product. Oh, thank you. To our legislative overlords. Oh, thank you. Thanks for making this possible. Thanks for making it happen. But it produces some real problems. Madam President, we find ourselves in a precarious economic position as a country. We've accumulated over $31 trillion in debt. We've seen federal spending explode astronomically just over the last few years. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were spending no more than about $4 trillion a year. Now, that was still a lot of money then, still a lot of money now. But if we were just spending now what we were spending then, our budget would be almost balanced. Last year, we brought in over $4 trillion in revenue. And it hasn't been more than just a few years ago that we were spending only $4 trillion a year. But what happened during and since the COVID-19 pandemic, commencing in 2020, changed everything. We went from spending about $4 trillion a year to 6.5, then 6.8 trillion a year. Still hasn't gone back down completely. We're on track to spend about $6 trillion this year. So, it's one of the problems when we run with numbers this big. The numbers million, billion, and trillion start to run together, and I've made that mistake enough times. Well, I want to be very clear. So you go from spending $4 trillion a year to 6.8 trillion a year, 6.5 trillion a year, still spending $6 trillion a year. We're still borrowing, even this year, about $2 trillion. It's such a staggering sum of money. The way our system works, you're doing more than just printing it. You have to go through additional steps of selling U.S. Treasury bonds, but it functions in a way that makes it feel almost indistinguishable from just printing money. Certainly has the same effect on the economy as if you were just printing money, because by definition, inflation is the condition in which you've got too many dollars chasing too few goods. When you just increase the money supply, you make it less affordable for people to do the things that they need to do. Everything gets more expensive. This is being felt everywhere. In Utah, the average family is having to spend an additional $1,000 a month every single month on their basic monthly expenses. Not luxury items, I'm just talking about the basics. Housing, food, fuel, healthcare. $1,000 a month more. The same basket of goods and services that they were purchasing just a few years ago. In fact, just before the day Joe Biden took office. Those things were $1,000 a month cheaper than they are now. This is the predictable, foreseeable, and in fact foreseen result of the government spending trillions of dollars a year more than it has. It's creating huge problems, serious problems. And yet no one has been able to answer the question, why are we still spending $2 trillion a year more than we're bringing in? Now that we are looking at the pandemic of COVID-19 as something that's behind us. Doesn't mean the virus has gone away, but we're no longer in a pandemic lockdown situation. There's no reason why we should be incurring ongoing annual deficits of that magnitude. And it's not sustainable, and this is not a victim-free event. This has victims everywhere. You know, look, rich people can figure out a way to get through inflationary periods just fine. They can absorb it, it means less to them, they've got savings they can rely on, assets they can liquidate, they'll be just fine. In fact, most sophisticated rich people can find a way to get richer during periods of massive inflation because of the inflation itself. It's really sad. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it's the government's fault, and it's our fault because we spend too much money. We're the ones causing it. Bills like this pass, members of Congress from both houses and both political parties go out and brag about it. They predictably get a lot of praise by the media that pretty much uniformly loves it when we pass big spending bills and hates it when members vote against it because they're not drinking the Kool-Aid. So you get short-term praise by the media when you do this. You get criticism when you vote against it. That's why most of our members end up voting for it, because they want praise. It's understandable to want praise, but at what cost? When the rich get richer and the poor get poorer as a result of our terrible spending decisions, especially decisions for which a lot of our members try to escape accountability by saying, sorry, I didn't want provisions A, B, C, D, and E. I wanted only provisions F and G. And I couldn't get those in unless I voted for the whole package. That's how we get to be $31 trillion in debt. That's how we get this federal government that spends like a drunken sailor in a way that puts drunken sailors to shame everywhere. That's how we get there, because you roll it all into one. This is the Prego spaghetti sauce of spending legislation. You name it, it's in there. It's all in there. 4,155 pages long. That's pretty long. Look, when I speak on the Senate floor, I'm told that I average about 120 words per minute. I've been told at times that's a little too fast. I should speak more slowly, but it's the rate at which I tend to speak. Even at this rate, if I were to read this bill and read it out loud on the Senate floor at my usual rate of about 120 words a minute, it would take me 5 straight days. And by 5 straight days, I mean the whole 24-hour period. No bathroom breaks, no sleeping, no lunch breaks, no anything else. Reading 24 hours a day, back to back, at 120 words per minute would take me 5 straight days. That sort of puts it in perspective. Yet we've gotten this morning, and literally by lunch, we were receiving pressure to schedule a final vote on it. So you leave us hanging for months. The fiscal year ended on September 30th. We've been operating with a continuing resolution since September 30th. And all of a sudden we get to December 20th and we're told, oh, this is, you got to do this right now. Can't operate another day on a continuing resolution. These continuing resolutions are bad now. They're so bad, in fact, you're going to have to vote for this bill or else shut down the government. Can't do this for another day. That's weird. But it's not just weird, it's devious. It's a corrupt process, and we all know it. The more we countenance this process by supporting bills like this and pretending it's okay when we know it's not, we impoverish the American people. We do them a grave disservice. Shame on us for doing that. Look, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, you can see that people are getting hurt. You can see that people are poorer because the federal government's spending money that it doesn't have. There are a small handful of people who will get rich off of this bill. Everybody else will get poorer by degrees. It's harder to tie those who have gotten poorer and the fact that they're getting poorer. It's hard to tie any one of them to any individual bill because it happens so subtly and so gradually. That's what makes this so evil by design. But it's intentional, and it's wrong. The bill is being advertised as a $1.7 trillion bill, something that's going to cost a total of $1.7 trillion. But as budget analysis from a number of entities has shown, it's more than that. The Heritage Foundation has conducted some analysis of this bill, and it's demonstrated that this bill will actually cost taxpayers at least $1.85 trillion in 2023, thanks to these base appropriations, along with the emergency and disaster spending and the statutory pay-go waiver built into the bill. Now, the authors of the bill recognize that if the bill were considered according to its own merits, it could not, would not pass. And there are a whole lot of features in this that fit that description that couldn't pass on their own. That's why they lump them all together. Takes priorities important to this member and to that member. You lump them all into one bill, and then you tell members you're not going to be able to vote for any of these things in isolation, so you better vote for this one or else you'll get nothing, and by the way, you'll be shutting down the government at the same time. There have been a number of people who have helped go through the analysis line by line. My staff has done an enormous amount of analysis. We've combed through this to try to figure out what some of the highlights and the lowlights are. My friend Scott Parkinson identified a series of the lowlights in one Twitter thread. He identified a few that I may point out here. In one of them, we see good news for the outgoing Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She's going to have a federal building named after her on 7th Street in San Francisco. It'll be called the Speaker Nancy Pelosi Federal Building. Congratulations to her. It's great. Fantastic. The Senate Appropriations Committee Chairman, my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Vermont, Pat Leahy. He's got some earmarks, including a measure renaming the Lake Champlain Basin Program as the Patrick Leahy Lake Champlain Basin Program. That one came at a cost. We had to stuff $35 million each year for the next 5 years in order to get that one. That's a pretty expensive name tag. I mean, gosh, you could buy the naming rights to a major sports arena for a lot less than that. You got that one in. But I've got to be bipartisan here. I'm not going to make this a strictly partisan speech. We've got other things in there. Apparently, there are some buildings in the state of Alabama that have yet to be named after our colleague Richard Shelby. I love Richard Shelby. Great man, Richard Shelby. Distinguished career. I guess there are some things in Alabama that still haven't been named after him. So he's gotten the facilities that the FBI has at the Redstone Arsenal. Those facilities are going to be named the Richard Shelby Center for Innovation and Advanced Training. That's great. Congratulations there. If you're a fan of presidential museums, this bill has some provisions you might like. This bill adds $6 million to the Ulysses S. Grant Museum. Now, he's got a museum already. I guess that museum needs some more bling in it. I don't know whether they're going to be gilding the walls of it, but they'll have $6 million to make it real nice. Some of this stuff is really obviously in the category of brazen partisanship. We've got $1.7 billion. It's being spent on transportation projects specifically designed to help fight climate change. That's a lot of money, $1.7 billion, going to fight climate change. It's not just transportation projects of the sort that are already needed. It's transportation projects specifically designed to fight climate change. Something tells me that wouldn't have the votes to pass the Senate if it had to stand on its own. In fact, I'm absolutely certain it wouldn't. But never mind, that's what the omnibus is for, another Christmas miracle. Throw it in there. Some of the more egregiously woke earmarks in the bill include $1 million going to something called Zora's House in Ohio, which is known as a co-working and community space for gender-expansive people of color. $750,000 for the Trans-Latin Coalition, $956,000 for the Equity Incubator at the universities at Shady Grove in Maryland, $791,000 for equitable energy resilience and electric vehicle infrastructure in Sonoma, California. I'm not sure what equitable energy resilience means, but I know it's woke, and a lot of people have got to be real happy at that. $477,000 will be going to the Equity Institute in Rhode Island. I don't know what they do there, but it sure sounds like fun if you're into equity programs. And the federal taxpayer will, of course, be picking up the cost of a $2.4 million tab for the New England Aquarium Corporation in Boston. They say that it's for modernization and educational programming at the aquarium. I love aquariums. It sounds like fun. I love going to aquariums. They're neat. They're great. But it's not radical to suggest that the taxpayers of the city of Boston or of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, hardly poverty-stricken areas of our country, shouldn't be funding that project that is specific to their community. No one's made the case as to why that aquarium's got to be built, why this has got to be a federal taxpayer project, but no matter. Another Christmas miracle. Just throw it in the Omni. It would also advance the left's attack on the traditional family by funding gender programs in Pakistan and family planning and reproductive health, quote, in areas where population growth threatens biodiversity or endangered species, close quote. What the heck does that mean? I think I know what that means. It's basically insisting that human beings should exist with less prevalence in some parts of the world. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen because they might be bad for the environment in those areas. That's what that means. Why in heaven's name we should be taking money from a poor farmer in Iowa or from a poor single mother of three in Orem, Utah, and sending that to Pakistan to tell people they've got to have fewer kids because biodiversity and climate change demand it. I'm sorry, that's too far. We do some crazy stuff up here, and sometimes we have to look the other way, or we try to look the other way, sort of like you do when you drive past a really awful accident. But this one, I can't look past that one. That's crazy. I'm not sure I could find more than 20 or 30 members of this body who would feel comfortable openly, publicly advocating for this. Not when you're taking money from a poor farmer in Iowa or a poor single mom in Orem, Utah, to send it for that purpose. But no matter, it's another Christmas miracle. Put it in the omnibus. The omnibus includes a total of about 3,200 earmarks. And what do I mean by earmarks? Well, earmarks are special interest giveaways. They're targeted spending Congress directs for a particular purpose. Earmarks have been severely abused. And one of the many ways in which they've been abused is through this process of lumping them all in. I've heard them referred to in the past as sweeteners. When members don't want to vote for a particular bill, you add earmarks to it, strategically allocating them one state at a time so that you can buy off votes. I don't mean buy them off in a legally corrupt way. This is a corrupt process, but it's not corrupt in a way that's legally, judicially cognizable. This is a way in which you accumulate votes by promising sweetheart deals for which members of Congress will receive praise. The rest of those people aren't going to know or care about the fact that we're sending money to Pakistan to tell people they've got to have fewer kids because climate change requires it. They're just glad that they got their handout, their carve-out. It's what creates the corrupt process. People who defend earmarks are fond of saying, well, they represent a relatively small portion of total federal spending, and that's true. The same could be said of the engine car on a train. It's a very small percentage of the length of the train. Yeah, but it's what's driving the train. People who advocate for this bill, I've heard them make this argument many times, including today. They will likewise say, I don't know why you're worrying about this bill, because after all, this bill deals with discretionary outlays, discretionary spending, not mandatory spending. Money that Congress gets to decide one year after the next as to where it goes, as opposed to mandatory spending, things like Social Security that are already required to be spent under existing ongoing law. So a lot of people will say you should vote for this bill because, yeah, we have a $31 trillion debt, and yeah, we've got an annual deficit that's still clocking in at around $2 trillion a year. But no worry, don't worry about that, because the real boogeyman is the mandatory spending, because that's bigger. Well, it's true that it's bigger, but the fact that something is smaller than something else doesn't mean you don't have to worry about that. The fact that earmarks are a relatively small percentage of total federal spending doesn't mean that earmarks don't have a really nasty effect in corrupting our political processes. Doesn't mean that they don't produce bad results. And the fact that discretionary spending is a smaller percentage of total federal spending than mandatory spending doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about it. It is, after all, the part over which we have discretion. So why we wouldn't worry about it is beyond my ability to comprehend. We have, moreover, dramatically increased the amount and the percentage of mandatory spending in federal outlays just in the last few years. It's part of what's exploded as we went fairly quickly from $4 trillion in total federal outlays as of 2019 to almost $7 trillion at the high watermark of the COVID pandemic era spending. So it's not an answer here to say there's more that we're spending elsewhere. We're still spending this money. This money still is under our control, and we've got some responsibility to review it. And that review is rendered more or less impossible to achieve when you pass a bill this way. This is wrong. It is a corrupt process. It uses extortion and fear in order to coerce members into voting for a bill that they know in their hearts is wrong. They know that this is fraught with all sorts of problems. There's a part of me that has a much easier time understanding my Democratic colleagues on this one. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative Republican at that, and yet I kind of have an easier time grasping and accepting Democrat support for this. This is much more consistent with Democratic priorities. This is, after all, a Democratic template funding a lot of Democratic policies. They're being consistent with their policy. I have a harder time accepting it as a Republican, a harder time accepting that we're going to have an estimated 20 or so Republicans who are already expressing support for this bill. Only less than 18 hours after this bill first saw the light of day, you've already got about 20 Republicans expressing support for it. It baffles me. It baffles me because, look, the Democrats openly embrace the idea that they are progressive, that they want more government, that they feel more comfortable with more government than Republicans do. So they're acting in a manner in conformity with their policies, platform, and their history, their traditions, their customs, their priorities. Much less so with Republicans. In fact, this is directly contrary to what Republicans campaign on. So what would we do when we get 10 to 20 Republicans who immediately support this? A bill that is predictably going to be supported by all 50 Democrats. They are united on this, and hats off to them for keeping their caucus united on this. They're all united. 50 Democrats are all in lockstep with this. They can't get it passed unless they get to 60, and so they need at least 10 Republicans. We supply those. There are 10 to 20 Republicans who are going to vote for this, uniting the Democrats around Democratic priorities and Democratic policies and Democratic spending levels. So yeah, I have a much easier time accepting and respecting those on the Democratic side who do this. They're at least on brand. We're not. And this, Madam President, is one of the reasons, I think, why Republicans lose more than many of us would prefer. When we dilute the brand, we dilute the message, we dilute the proclaimed policy preferences for a more responsible process by which we allocate federal funds. Then we do this. This is tough. Now, some of my Republican colleagues will respond to this by saying, no, this is a win, I promise. And they'll cite a few things. They'll say, well, this is a big win because, among other things, it contains cuts to IRS funding. I'm sorry, that's really hard for me to accept when whatever cuts, whatever restraint was shown with regard to IRS funding here is absolutely dwarfed by the fact that the IRS just got $80 billion of supplemental funding in August. So forgive me, but I find that difficult, no, impossible to accept as a legitimate explanation as to why this is a win for Republicans. To make matters worse, perhaps the most offensive part of this is that Senate Republicans voting for this bill are choosing to forfeit the power that they have, that we have, the power of the purse. It could be used, if wielded more assertively and cautiously, to end the crisis at our border. And it is a crisis. In fact, this bill, while providing funding for government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, in charge of enforcing the border, but utterly and defiantly, willfully refusing to do its job, this bill expressly prohibits Customs and Border Patrol funding from being used to improve border security. Let that sink in for a minute. Not only are we losing the opportunity, forfeiting it by passing this, to put in aggressive measures requiring border enforcement as a condition precedent for the receipt of certain federal funds. We're actually providing their funding and allowing language to be included in there that prohibits them from bolstering border security at a time when we're being besieged by illegal border crossings. This is lawlessness. So no, I really struggle with calling this a win for Republicans, especially given the fact we just had an election. And in that election, We went from having a Congress consisting of a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, and we've, of course, got a Democratic White House. Now we're going to still have a Democratic Senate, but we're going to have a Republican-controlled House, just in a matter of a couple of weeks. For this reason that I came to the floor last week and twice tried to pass continuing resolutions that would keep us funded on a short-term basis into next year. Had we done that, Congress still may have chosen to enact this spending legislation, which we hadn't seen until about 19 hours ago. Still could have done that, but it wouldn't have been under the extortive threat of a shutdown at Christmas time. Tragically, the Senate declined to adopt that, declined to adopt either of those resolutions, and instead opted for this position. Why? Well, because had they adopted either of those continuing resolutions, it would have become impossible to use the extortive threat of a Christmas time shutdown in order to secure votes for this. So, of course, the proponents of this legislation didn't want that, and rain on their party, make it harder for them. But the American people suffer as a result. But what you've got are Republicans who vote for this bill. They're going to be facilitating Democratic priorities, and by so doing, undercutting the Republican House of Representatives that's about to be sworn in. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is opposed to this. He's stated publicly and privately he thinks this is a mistake. It's a mistake for Republicans. And it is. You know, Madam President, since 1954, we've seen that the House of Representatives has had a shift in the party in control of it only 5 times, each during midterm elections. Just 5 times since 1954. It doesn't happen that often. In all 5 of those instances since 1954, when it's flipped, Congress did not enact a comprehensive omnibus spending package during the lame duck session following the election. There are a number of reasons for this, including the fact that members of Congress, I think in both houses and both political parties, understand that elections are supposed to have consequences. It's really inappropriate, I think, at least for Republicans. I suppose I have to have a form of respect for my Democratic colleagues in wanting to enact their policies. But I struggle with understanding why Republicans would want to help them in doing that, rendering the incoming Congress less capable of enacting Republican priorities. Especially when you consider a couple things. Number one, this spending bill, assuming it passes, which appears certain, just about certain that it will, this will keep the federal government funded through the balance of fiscal year 2023, up until midnight on September 30th, 2023. That by itself is a big chunk, very large chunk, of the entire time that the 118th Congress will even exist. It's a big piece of that. So that part of it will be having a government that doesn't operate under a spending bill with a significant Republican imprint. But it's not just that, Madam President. In light of the fact that we're going to have a divided Congress, we're going to have a Democratic Senate and a Republican House with a Democratic White House. It may be difficult, of course, to pass another omnibus or perhaps a series of spending bills. It could end up resulting in more continuing resolutions. Well, guess what continuing resolutions do? They keep spending levels where they have been. That's where we get to the point where, over time, this has spillover ramifications. The high cost of this bill will far outlast this Congress. They'll far outlast the balance of fiscal year 2023. They'll last for years. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget recently estimated that over the next decade, this could end up increasing federal outlays. Just this omnibus spending bill, as compared to a continuing resolution, would likely cost a total of an additional $2 trillion over the next decade, just because of the baselines being shifted. Why Republicans want to do that is beyond my ability to understand. I implore them to reconsider. There's a good reason why outgoing Congresses in the past have not enacted omnibus spending packages post-election during a lame duck session when control of the House has just shifted. Meanwhile, our border crisis continues to boil over. It's getting worse and worse and worse every day, and it's subjecting far too many people to the harms associated with human trafficking. A very large percentage by some studies, 30% or so by some studies, it's more like 65% of the girls and women who come across with these drug traffickers who operate as human smugglers, bringing them into the United States, making these drug cartels billions of dollars a month. Somewhere between 30 and 65% of the women and girls brought through that process are raped or sexually assaulted in the process. This has also resulted in fentanyl pouring into the United States, enough fentanyl to kill millions of Americans. We're doing nothing about that in this bill, and as I said a moment ago, what we are doing in this bill is making it more difficult to fund border enforcement. It prohibits the funds going to Customs and Border Enforcement from being used for border enforcement, to increase border security. And meanwhile, as our border crisis continues to boil over and we do nothing about it, and we plant the seeds for making sure that we can do nothing about it through this legislation, we do nothing about that. We do nothing about that, but we do something else that's really, really curious. It provides Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia, and Oman $410 million to secure their borders. Well, that's great. That's just fantastic. If you live in one of those countries. This bill is all about Middle Eastern and North African border security. It's not about American border security. This bill is not America first. It's America last. What we're doing here is putting America last. What we're doing here is putting our constituents last. What we're doing here is putting a small handful of elites first. This bill is the product of Wall Street and K Street, not Main Street. We've got to get back to a process that respects the rights of individual members. And I call on all within the sound of my voice, Democrat or Republican, House or Senate, all members of Congress within the sound of my voice, whether you plan on voting for this bill or not, if you're thinking about voting for it, I implore you, reconsider. If not us, who? If not now, when? If we don't stop this at some point, sometime, this will continue, and it will continue to weaken America. We can stop this if and only if, when and only when, members stop supporting this nonsense. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. You know this is wrong. Let's stop it before it's too late. Thank you, Madam President.